No. I just loved the title, The Snow Queen, and it wasn't really taken from the Hans Christian Andersen fairy tale. For that book, snow in English is a sort of slang term for cocaine. Queen is a slang term for a gay man. I figured probably the same. And it was just too good, and I thought, I don't care if Hans Christian Andersen got it first. It's still available.
Yeah.
And now this book is actual fairy tales.
Yeah.
Well, for one thing, I think for many of us, these are the first stories we've heard. The myths, the fairy tales, most of us were very young when we hear them, and I think they affect us very deeply. You grow up and you read adult novels, but when your parents are reading a fairy tale to you and you're 5, it kind of goes into your bloodstream. The story merges with your body. So I've always been interested in fairy tales, and this book started by accident. I would write a little story here, a little story there, just to read to my friends. It was not originally meant to be a book. I just had enough of them, and I showed my editor, and this is not supposed to be a book. Yes.
It's a beautiful work.
I think great. I'm so proud of her. Trouble finding an illustrator. I thought be easy, but a lot of the illustrators we found were for children's books, and I wanted something beautiful but dark and perverse. A lot of graphic novelists don't want to illustrate my book, and I Googled illustrators, and I found Yuko Shimizu's page, which I just thought was not only incredibly beautiful, but just what I was thinking. And my publisher called her up, and she read the stories, and she said yes. So I met her for the first time after she'd agreed, and she said, "What did you have in mind?" And I said, "I would like you to do whatever you want to do. I don't want to give you instructions. Whatever images feel right to you, I want this to be as much of a collaboration as it can be. Surprise me." And she did. I think fairy tales start with children and inhabit our imaginations our entire life. That our sense of magic and danger, and some of the primal human qualities don't come from fairy tales, but fairy tales are our first exposure to the idea that there's something out there in the woods, there's rescue coming from the sky. Yeah, there was no system.
Yeah.
Beyond just the fairy tales I loved most as a child. I was a slightly morbid child, and so I liked the dark, scary ones better. So there's more dark, scary ones in here. But yeah. I really somehow imposing some kind of organizing principle on a collection of fairy tales didn't feel right. Didn't feel in the spirit of fairy tales, because it's really just your favorite. It's what your grandmother feels like telling you that night. So these are the ones I love most.
Do you agree with that?
Oh, absolutely. They are for adults, I don't think you'd read some of these to children, not to my child. These are homages. I love these fairy tales. It's not some kind of postmodern, silly old fairy tales. But I did want to bring a kind of adult complexity to them. When I was a child, and my mother or my grandmother would read these stories to me, and so often you get to the words, and they lived happily ever after, and I would go on. What's next? And they say, no, that's the end. And it's no, that can't be the end. That doesn't. Where do they go from there? Yeah, and my mother would just light a cigarette and say, go to bed. But now that my mother can't make me go to bed anymore, some of them are about what happens happily ever after, and many of them sort of try to deal with the fact that in our lives there's not really happily ever after, and for many of us there's not unhappily ever after. It's the hour, it's the day, it's whatever. And so I wanted to bring a little more adult ambiguity and complexity. Always the but.
Yeah, but
good fiction. Good fiction. Yes, yes. I think one of the differences between what I would call serious fiction and pulp fiction is that in pulp fiction there's no but. She meets the man of her dreams and everything is fine. And there's a satisfaction in that. But that's a different kind of literature. The books I love most, there's a but. And there's a feeling as well that no story really comes to an end. Because so you're just talking about a little section of the big story, and you leave it at a certain point. That's the end of that story. But it's never the end of the story. Yes. No, that's absolutely right. There's something great about having a plot already so that you can move on from there. You don't have to invent it from scratch. And by the way, I should mention, I just said postmodern. I don't know what postmodernism is. I don't think anybody does. But what I'm thinking of is books we don't really read anymore. A story about a man thinking about writing a story about a man thinking about writing a story. It's not that cerebral. A little bit, yeah. I had Mrs. Dalloway.
Yeah.
It's easier that way.
Yeah, of course.
Just steal a plot and move on from there. I mean, believe me. I'm not comparing myself to Shakespeare, but all the Shakespeare plays are based on old stories. Much significant literature comes. Madame Bovary came from a new story, which is a little different, but yeah. Yes. The writer is first the reader, and then the reader is the writer. Because no two people read the same book, right? So any book is a sort of blueprint for the reader to imagine his or her own book. I'll say Anna Karenina. All three of us have a different person in mind. Are very much aware of the fact that a book is an exchange between a writer and a reader, separated in time and space, but first the writer invents the book and then the reader reinvents the book. Yeah, You know, I find that every book I write sort of reveals its purposes as I write it. It's one of those questions for which I don't really have an answer. I don't know why I want to write this book and then that book. It's mysterious. There are lots of things I do that I more or less understand, but wanting to write a book is a little bit like beginning to fall in love. You fall in love with that person. And there's probably somebody more beautiful and kind sitting next to you, but you're in love with that person. You don't know why. Well, it was different for me because a fairy tale has to be a short story. No one wants to read a book-length Cinderella. Well, I don't anyway. They're meant to be short stories. I ordinarily don't really write short stories. I love short stories. I read them all the time, but my mind doesn't work that way. In 15 pages, I need more room. I need more space for things to accumulate, for meanings to start to take on significance over a series of pages. I'm astounded when I read a really great short story. I think, how did you do that in such a short period of time? I mostly can't. Oh, sure. I mean, this is a book of fairy tales, but I think a lot of the books we read that we don't think of as fairy tales at all sort of have their basis in fairy tales. There was a foolish princess named Emma, and the wicked witch of petite bourgeois society brought her down. I mean, it's more than a fairy tale, but there's roots in books that we don't think of as fairy tales at all. But still, there's a princess, there's a witch. No, absolutely. It's a little tricky because you want the story to be satisfying. You want the reader to feel like they've gotten somewhere. But you also want to leave it open because nobody knows where it's going, and a good book tries to be as much like life as possible, and we don't know. So all an author can do is say, well, I've taken these people this far, thank you for coming along, we'll see.